Good morning, good morning, good morning. It's going to shock you to know that we have a full 50 minutes. Yes? So I want to go ahead and get started on time. This is the third session on Christian nationalism with Dr. David Pacini. Dr. Pacini.
Yes, I'm on. It's good to see you all again. I'm grateful for the opportunity to have shared this time with you. I've been claiming that for the last few weeks that we are reluctant, if not reticent, to assess Christian nationalism because it's emotionally upsetting to us. It's a whirlwind, indeed a cacophony of misunderstandings, because there's so many voices saying different things and so many different movements. All of these are not uniform, so I have been giving myself the opportunity to use the term problem constellation, which by now you should recognize. Those who have been students of mine have groaned because I have made them learn about problem constellations. It's worth probably saying why I do that. Most events that occur in life are not causally connected. What you do is you get up in the morning and you get confronted with an array of events which seemingly have no relationship one to another, but there they are. Nonetheless, they have an effect. It's not an amalgamation, but it's rather resonances that get going within which a field emerges of a sensibility. So that's what I'm talking about. So as a historian, I can tell you that there's something rather unique about the period that began with the writing of Rousseau's Emile. And there were then, between that publication and the publication of Marx's work, more than 100 books that suddenly exploded on the scene in a very brief period. And it's not because they were connected to each other, but there was something in the air. So I've been trying to say that Christian nationalism has to do in part with something that's in the air, and we don't always understand what it is. But suppose that these misunderstandings from so many different things, and the principal feature of which makes us nervous, exceptionalism, is tied to a third thing, namely loss. And I think what really gets us bothered more than anything else, even beyond the exceptionalism, is the sense of loss that goes along with this. So today I will be leaning in the direction of talking about what that loss might consist in. So here are the many pictures of different sides of Christian nationalism, and the claim built into the midst of it all of a kind of exceptionalism. And then the real confusion that we talked about last week, which is the way that we talk about this is derived from a vocabulary that we share, Christian vocabulary, although that vocabulary has been developed over the course of time. So I talked a little bit about the pre-humanist, the humanist, and the post-humanist, and the different emphases here captured by the Byzantine sense of God as holding up the cross, that's the center crucifix, and then the extraordinary Brunelleschi crucifix, which emphasizes the human features rather than the necessarily divine features. And then the brokenness of postmodernism, which is in the third crucifix. And I also said, in order to get myself out of a good deal of trouble, that just because you see something doesn't mean that you necessarily see it the same way as somebody else does. And I took refuge behind the wisdom of Ludwig Wittgenstein. I always find Germans or German-likes types to explain things because I sound clear by way of contrast. But what Wittgenstein managed to say with great clarity is that what appears on the one hand as a duck very quickly can appear like a rabbit. And part of the issue of Christian nationalism is that it's frequently a duck and rabbit proposition with lots of emotions attached and very little agreement about whether we're talking about a duck or a rabbit. Then I talked a little bit about the history, and I've tried to say that what makes this thing so very interesting is that it grows out of both Catholic and Protestant roots. We know, all of us, Lord Acton's statement about knowledge corrupts and absolute knowledge corrupts absolutely. So what that becomes is a source of Christian libertarianism, which is continued to the 20s and 30s in this country. And then that will issue eventually in an attempt to develop an American sense of its own religious identity. And each of these things, Lord Acton was really worried about the excesses of monarchianism. So he was holding up individualism, and he felt that there was a loss. And when you have the American libertarians, they're feeling that there's the loss of individualism under the threat of the New Deal. And when you get to Billy Graham and Fulton Sheen and Dwight Eisenhower, they're feeling a sense of loss of an American way because of the growing threat of communism. And so they worked together with J. Edgar Hoover to promote an American evangelical Christian faith. And that's where we get the notion of America as a Christian nation. In God we trust becomes the motto, and one nation under God becomes part of the pledge. That's all under Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower was I know I've had a lot of hard things to say about Presbyterians, but that's only because, you talk most fiercely about your parents, that's where I came from. Apparently, it's also where the dean came from. So we share the little discomforts every once in a while about our errant past. In any event, I want to point out that this wasn't mean-spirited. This was a genuine attempt to say something that was true about America in the face of great peril, or at least what was perceived as great peril. Meanwhile, the world didn't sit still, and Vatican II occurred. Now, Vatican II, for many, represented the threat of a very, very genuine loss of traditions. And so a group of people emerged out of that, both in the clergy. There was a cardinal who fought against the church and who was eventually excommunicated. He was a French cardinal. But there were movements that gave rise to a company of people known as integralness. And the integralness folk thought that tradition was integral to the faith, and that what was going on with John and followers was the elimination. So the fear of loss was the fear of the loss of tradition. And that inspired some other Catholics, a Melkite Catholic by the name of Paul Weirish, and then another Catholic, Leo A. Leonard, and they worked together, Weirish founding the Heritage Foundation and Leonard founding the Federalist Society, And they needed a spokesperson. And you want to talk about real cooperation between Catholics and Protestants. They didn't go looking for a Catholic. They found Jerry Falwell. And so he became the titular head of what became known as the moral majority. But it was Weirish who named that. Okay. So we then have this carried forward with Reagan, but Reagan is leaning back on Fulton Sheen and someone that we haven't talked about but needs to be mentioned in passing, Norman Vincent Peale, on the power of positive thinking, which was Marble Collegiate Church. And Marble Collegiate Church was, I would say non-denominational, but it says that it's Methodist. So Norman Vincent Peale wasn't really interested in Methodism, but he was very interested in the power of positive thinking. So you have that group, and then you have a group of conservative evangelical Presbyterians, Cornelius Van Til, and C. Peter Wanger, and Schaeffer, and Doug Wilson, that's right. And they're all working on this idea of the manifest destiny of America. But in addition to just talking about the manifest destiny of America, they're talking about restoring a way of life that was characteristic of what we would now say the 1950s. And so you have pictures of, this is what we looked like when we went to church. Well, I was going to church in the 1950s. I don't quite remember it that way, but that's probably because my father was the minister. And if I made any noise, my mother wasn't smiling. So I would kick the pew and she would kick me. It was a very simple arrangement. But the pictures that go along with this are extraordinary, you see, because you have this notion that somehow we're following the pilgrim faith. Notice that these are pilgrims who look like they lived in 1950. They don't very much look like the folk who were in pretty ill repair who showed up on the shores years ago. So there is this growing notion of America as the shining city, on the hill, which is a great theme that Reagan promotes. And we get a growing sense of the importance of American exceptionalism. And that's contrasted with our own exceptionalism, by which I mean when the clergy in this room get a hold of us and baptize us, they may have to chase us for a while, but once they get us there, they then quickly whip out their little, grease pad and then mark your head with an, And so now you are blessed and you are marked as Christ's own forever. Now we all listen to that, right? We just say, there it is. But we don't really sit down and say, what on earth just happened? Well, what happened was you just became part of an exceptionalist community, but its sense of exceptionalism is different from the exceptionalism that's being talked about by the Christian nationalists. And that's part of our discomfort, because we're not entirely clear about our exceptionalism. We kind of know it's there. And we kind of stand tall, particularly as Episcopalians, we do it right? We know how to just do it. I came from a camp of Methodists. Methodists are always very anxious about not doing it right. And so the Methodists stay busy because they want to become perfect. And they have this doctrine of perfection. So it's sort of like if you scrub behind your ears long enough, you're going to make it. So if you go to a Methodist retreat, for example, one of the things I learned, because I went to more than I cared to, as a faculty member in a Methodist school, there is no downtime. I mean, you go from event to event to event to event, and we're all moving to perfection, and we're gonna love each other. It's gonna be, okay. You know, so we're the little engines that could. That's not what is being talked about in being marked as Christ's own. What's being talked about is a sense of orientation. I can't tell you how many people have come up to me and said, "Did you read David Brooks' editorial this week?" I said, "Yeah," and started with George sending me the copy. And then, you know, the Times finally arrived, and there it was on the editorial page. And so I read it very carefully, and I thought, you know, that's really very interesting. You know, he thinks that it's a zero-sum gain if you say we versus they, and then he gets into an editorial in which he does we versus they. And so I smiled, and I said, well, we're saying that that's not the way to go. We're going to do a response that's a little bit deeper. It's a response that says we're going to learn to live in the ambiguity by understanding that within ambivalence and the threat of loss that ambivalence poses is also the source of grace. That is the location of grace, in the middle of ambivalence. And we have this wonderful, wonderful tradition that teaches us about this. What it says is, first and foremost, that loss is not an erosion of institutional principles. That's not the kind of loss we're talking about. What we're talking about instead, which is really very powerful, is God forgetfulness. Calvin and Schleiermacher talked about God forgetfulness. Calvin is just remarkable in the way he says it. We're so lost we don't know how lost we are. And we had a good moment in Presbyterianism, but only when we're found do we recognize we were lost. This has been a very helpful insight, particularly when I'm driving and I get lost. And my wife says, "Do you know that you're lost?" And I am able to draw on Calvin and say, no, actually, I'm getting found. So there's this whole business, but you don't know that you're lost until you're found, and you don't know that you have forgotten God until you remember God. But here's the point, and George and I argue about this because I say, this is not about, if you just think about this a little bit more clearly, you'll get this all sorted out. And I accuse him of semi-Pelagianism, and which just sends him, into orbit, and which is half the fun of it. But the point is, you can't think your way into grace. If you suddenly remember that you've forgotten God, that's a moment of grace that's given to you. And the main kind of spiritual privation that I'm talking about is the loss of the sense of something being given to you. Now think about it. We're all very, very clear about getting out and doing all the right things. But the loss of the sense of something given to you, like a moment shared with another person in which suddenly a genuine insight into life emerges. And it wasn't because you sat down and said, okay, we're going to have an insight now, and we're going to just paddle along. It's that suddenly there is an event that occurs in which you are shown, there is a showing of something that you didn't generate. When I was very young, I got saddled with walking my younger brother home in the middle of a rainstorm when it was very cold and when my mother had forgotten to pick us up. My younger brother was none too pleased with this event, and so I began to console him by saying, well, you know, we're Italian. And what that means is we have thick skin. And it also means it's greasy. And that oil keeps the rain from getting in, you see, rolls right off. And so we're gonna make it. He was none too impressed with that. But 70 years later, as he lay dying, he said to me, you know, every night when I go to bed, I think and hear your voice saying, we're Italian and we have thick skin and we're gonna make it there. That's the grace. I had no idea that that would be a moment that would be illuminating for him. What we're talking about when we're talking about loss is a sense of not having that kind of illumination, a sense of not having that moment given to us. So that becomes a challenge to what we want to say about our belief. And so the question is, how do we talk about that? And interestingly enough, George put me on to somebody who wants to talk about acceleration. And so I said, well, you know, that's not exactly a new topic. And so, you know, being the historian, I said, this goes back to Dilthey and to Troeltsch and to Weber and Dieter Henrich, who was my teacher. And what they said was there was this insight about force that comes up in Newton, mass acceleration, but what was really about is the principle of inertia, that a body in motion stays in motion. But the insight of modern discourses was in order to stay in motion, you had to kind of work at things. And then we have this wonderful man, Hartmut Rosa, who said, well, yeah, but what happens is time keeps expanding and you run faster and faster. It sounds like a Methodist retreat again, okay? You run faster and faster trying to get caught up. In our house, we sometimes have to-do lists. I always shudder when mine arrives. But one of the characteristics of the to-do list is that there are more events and items on the list than can possibly be accomplished. Now, the interesting thing about Rosa, as opposed to my wife, is that Rosa says, well, there's a profound sense of loss because you can't get there. She says, if you just try a little harder, you will, David. And then, just to make matters worse, she not only gets through her list, but adds a few things to it. So there's the shame that goes along with it. But the reality is, we live in this sense that no matter how hard we try, we can't keep up. You know, that time's gonna run out. And so we get caught in this notion about time. And the question is, well, what kind of time are we talking about? Is it all about time perpetually getting away? Or is it something else? And I'm going to suggest that this very august insight about the expansion of time being at the base of our sense of loss, the sense that you didn't get enough time with a friend or a family member. And that kind of glosses over the more important point about the resonances that you shared. Well, why does that get glossed over? Well, we've had a whole lot of literature about this, and leave it to me. I've decided to bring it all in here and just dump it on you. So it goes back to the 50s with David Reisman writing The Lonely Crowd. And there's this wonderful New Yorker cartoon, which sort of gets it. You can be standing in the middle of everything. It's up on the top. You stand up in the middle of it and you don't feel connected at all. And this becomes the topic of something. Now, George preached about the culture of narcissism, and I want to build on that and say the insight of Lash was not that we had, an excess of the me generation from the 70s, which is what a lot of people thought he was saying. It was a far deeper insight than that. His insight was that institutional practices and arrangements had developed in such a way that it was creating and cultivating and nurturing narcissistic pathology in people. So you were being trained by the very institutions. This wasn't about, you grew up and you had a fight with your mother. This was, you were being trained by the culture and its assumptions. This was followed, and now we get to the dean, because he talked about Bella and Sheilaism. And Bella was really remarkable in that he traced, by going around with a group of his disciples, and talking with endless numbers of people about why it was that they had trouble making commitments. And the overwhelming point was that individualism had grown, and Bella loved de Tocqueville, and so he kept invoking de Tocqueville and the spirit of democracy, America, and how we were all supposed to be, but we weren't. And then Robert Putnam, came up with a book entitled Bowling Alone. And his point, very simply, was we all used to bowl in leagues, but now you go bowling by yourself. You go to a bowling alley and you see a bunch of people coming in doing their own thing, but that isn't connected. So he bewailed the loss of connectivity. So what we're really talking about here, when we're talking about loss, is the disappearance of connectivity. This becomes incredibly important to hold in mind, because this is probably the whole point of this series. The disappearance of connectivity awakens an appetite for someone to tell me what to do. Tell me how to connect. Tell me where I can find some kind of salvation. Well, if the theoretical stuff doesn't get to you, the pandemic did. And what the pandemic did was in my view, it turned on its head our sense of our assumptive world. That is, the practices, the resonances, the rituals, the tiny things we did every day, all of a sudden got completely upended, and we were at a loss. We didn't realize how we'd built this world of tiny little things that helped us form connections with other people and with ourselves, and suddenly they were gone. And we were all running around, in masks and being isolated from one another, which was a symbol of what was happening, according to all of the sociologists, in the larger culture. Then we have the last piece that I'm going to drown you with. And this is an essay by Derek Thompson. And it's entitled The Antisocial Century. And he builds on the same thing, but his story is a little bit different. He's a young guy, and he goes with his wife, and they decide, it's a hot summer afternoon, let's just go and grab a margarita at the little Mexican restaurant. And they go in, and there's a sign that says, bar closed. This was not happy news. But they see 25 or 30 brown paper bags sitting on the bar. So he sits and he kind of watches, and one after another, people come in, they pick up the bag and they go. They pick up the bag and go. It's the to-go thing. But he said what that means is you're not connecting with anybody. You're not connecting with anybody at all. And that leads to a deep sense of disconnectedness. Now, he thought that emerged as far back as the invention of the automobile, which is a fascinating point, because now we didn't have to do things together. I mean, you had your car, I had my car, and we all did our own thing. I grew up largely in the Northeast, where they know how to drive. And one of the features of, now it's different. My Boston time was different from my New York time. My New York time, everybody knows what the hell the rules are. They go like crazy, but they know what the rules are. Boston, there's a blessing. It tests my theory of grace. Because the rule is, I didn't see you before you didn't see me. And that works out at the Sumner Tunnel, where 12 lanes converge to 2. And there's no lights or signs or anything. It's up, you just get in there, okay? So you zip right ahead, and you take your place, and it's everybody out for themselves. It's a fascinating kind of thing, and yet everybody winds up at the airport. Or sometimes I would wind up at the airport because I was so used to the habit that I forgot that I wasn't really going there anyway. I just got caught up, swept up in the I didn't see you before you didn't see me. Now here, I don't think I have to tell you about what it's like to go out on the roads. Here, you take your life in your hands, particularly if it's raining. But God help you if it is snowing. Not that it ever does, but there's the thought of snowing. And the thought of snowing does you in. So that's the automobile piece. The second piece in Thompson's analysis was the invention of the television. Now you didn't go to the theater anymore. You just sat at home and you watched. And then the third, of course, was the computer, and the fourth was the cell phone. And so you thought, by the virtue of the computer and by virtue of the cell phone, that you were part of the most connected generation that ever came down the road. Except, you're over here watching, so you're more connected and you're more disconnected. And so that becomes an enormous crisis. That affects our sense of loss. Our sense of connectivity. And when we try to get a sense of being connected back, there are two basic types of fidelity. One is where you sort of impose a sense of order. We all know about that. We grew up. And if you think your parents weren't telling you what the order was, they reminded you that my father with the belt, but the reality was the order was one of dominion. And that can be extended because you can have dominion over the known, and then you can get a theologian who says, well, God said you have dominion. And so you have that whole trajectory that is part of Christian nationalism. It's dominion over the known. It's a chronological sense of things. Now, there's this whole thing about being marked as Christ's own. And the fact you say, well, I don't know what that means. Well, that's the most honest confession that you've made, because it's to say you're marked to face the unknown together. It doesn't mean, okay, you got the contents. I hope I'm all right on this. You don't have the marked road. You don't have the map. What you have is the discovery that the map is not the same thing as the road. The road is unknown. The map is just a suggestion about what the road might be. But the road unfolds in its own way. And your fidelity is a fidelity to the road, to what comes up as you go along, not reading. Now, this is where David Brooks got it right. One's faith is not about reciting creeds. It's about how you live. I want to take it one step deeper. It's how you live in the face of the unknown, and a willingness to do that with others. This is an ancient depiction of dominion over earth. And this is what I'm proposing, which is the exploration of the unknown. And I'm going to say further that what's really at stake in the exploration of the unknown is recognizing that that's the core of the Christian exceptionalism, is standing together in the face of the unknown. That's what it means to be marked as Christ's own. Now that creates some discomfort for us. And so it begets within us a willingness to do something that we accuse Christian nationalists of, which is indifference. I had the good fortune when I was a graduate student to have Elie Wiesel as one of my teachers. And he impressed upon us the horrors of indifference. See, indifference enables you to be able to say, that doesn't matter. That doesn't count. Well, you can do that, you see, with people of different races and different genders and different sexual orientations. They don't count. So the real challenge, you see, when we look at what's disturbing us about our own exceptionalism is to realize how much our own Christian practices, we the good guys, have hurt those who have been on the margins, whom we have placed on the margins through our practices. And one of the reasons we don't like to talk about our exceptionalism is it's very uncomfortable to realize that there's no we, they between us and Christian nationalists. It's part of the human condition that we don't do very well. It's a category that we avoid like the plague, but it's called sin. And it doesn't mean a host of different things that you do that you ought to have done differently. What it means is a way of being in the world that is indifferent, that doesn't see in all that is a living manifestation of the creation. So in the known and the unknown, in the familiar and the unfamiliar, Christian nationalism brings us into the face that grace appears in the tension between those two. There's no clear-cut, I'm sorry, David Brooks. There is no clear-cut path. There is learning to live in ambiguity. That doesn't mean living without fortitude or without commitment. It means understanding that these things are far more complex and touch nerves that go very deep in people. And learning to live in connection with that. Now, where does this come up to frighten us the most? Well, the shining city is not the one that's seen from above board. The shining city was, with my ancestors, seen from the bottom of a ship hold through the windows. My great-grandparents came to this country, and you could see through the windows. And so what we're really talking about is opening ourselves up again to the refugee and realizing that our children have become refugees because they don't know about connection. They don't know about finances. They don't know about how to navigate the world. They are committed to transactionalism and not to relationality. And if you wonder what the appeal of Christian nationalism is that they walk in with a nice, neat template of here's what relationships look like. Here's the top, here's the bottom, here's the ordering, and it is drawing tens of thousands of young people. This suggests that if we're paying attention, not that we offer a plate or a template to compete, it means instead we say it doesn't work that way. The template, if you will, the connectivity that we're talking about in this community is an openness to facing the unknown together, and to be charitable and kind and loving to one another, and brutally honest that we stumble just as much as everybody else, but we're willing to admit it and try to live into something that looks a little bit more like the world of relationships that we would like to inhabit. Thank you. I think I left enough time for George to get the questions.
Well, yes, thank you very much. Do you have questions? If so, raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone so that when people listen to the podcast later, they'll be able to hear your question clearly.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
I come from a medical background, and I've been trying to figure out since the pandemic why in the world there would be people who would not wear a mask knowing that it could help save their lives. And I've never been able to figure it out, but something came to me today when you talked about connection. I'm wondering, on a sort of psychological basis or perspective, if that idea of not wearing the mask in some way could represent a feeling of loss of connection if they wore it. In other words, isolation or barrier. I'm just wondering what
I think that's a
are.
very perceptive observation. I think it has to be coupled with the fact that some people just don't want to be told to be doing anything. I'm the father of a number of sons, and I can attest to the truth of that. You know, you make a suggestion and you might as well, talk to the brick wall. But when they discover it, it's just awesome. But I think there's something about not being told that goes along with that. And I try to be more respectful of that. I mean, part of me sides with you on this one and just say, I can't imagine a world in which you would not wear a mask out of a sense of community and caring for others. But I think there is always the longing that goes on for connection, and we don't know how to get there. A mask might seem to some to be an impediment to that. I think that's a great point.
So I've sort of diagnosed myself as a loquacious optimist.
Oh, good.
And so
You're in good company.
So my experience, which I've been practicing, I would not say that long, is that because of, I'm trying to make something good out of what you're talking about in separation. And so my perspective is, it's the richest time ever to connect with people. And I practice it in many, whether I'm in a store, whether I'm playing with someone I don't know, playing tennis with them, or wherever it might be, where what do we sing about? And one was a soldier, and one was slain by a fierce wild beast. That is the common feeling among our nation, our people, and so stick your hand out and say hello, or how are you doing, or make an observation about the environment you're in, and you get a very, very loving, positive reception.
I think that's marvelous. I think it's also the case that sometimes you put your hand out and you get spurned. And what I was trying to say was not to give up on the altruistic vision, but to say, I think we live in ambiguity. And the ambiguity is ambivalence, but I don't think that ambivalence is a bad thing. It means literally two valencies, ambi, both valencies. And it's the surprise that grace emerges in the midst of those valencies. When someone who you thought was going to push you away doesn't. When our way of seeing things gets upended. I don't know, I'm always pleasantly surprised. C.S. Lewis called it surprised by grace.
This has really been informative and enlightening in so many ways. I have read a summary, 200 Dangerous Truths, if you will, about Project 2025, which is, reflective of Christian nationalism and a patriarchal, going back to the 50s patriarchal structure, and basically denying people of color, people of different religions, LGBTQ plus community,
right.
Women, the whole let's tear down all the DEI things, remove the black slave with his with lashes on his back, remove the women who were war heroes, all the things. So with that, I have a very clear feeling and picture of Christian nationalism not being a good path.
Yeah.
And that, any culture or government or system or individual who would ignore or protect pedophiles and abuses of power is beyond, it's indefensible in my view, especially if you call yourself a Christian, because there's a vertical morality, which I recently read in an article, that's why they think everything's coming from God, or they claim that their decisions are being made for God, for whatever reason. But then there's horizontal morality, which we all understand as being good to your neighbor, and every human being was made by God. We're all earthlings. We all deserve the basic dignity and respect of human beings. So I would like to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, I think I designed this set of remarks to pose the question in a different way. In other words, to say, why are we upset about it? It says something about us, and it's uncanny that what we discover in our great discomfort is our dis-ease with being in the presence of grace. That's a theological point, but I think it's one worth making. It's difficult for us, as much as the points you've made are clear. Bipern, that doesn't sweep it under the rug at all. It says, rather than putting into nice, neat categories, which are fairly carefully defined, we risk, in another discourse, saying there's more going on here. That doesn't excuse it. For example, one of the features that I didn't weigh in on, but it's very much part of this, is the lost cause of the South narrative. Now that's a narrative with which many of us grew up, whether we knew it or not. And that was a retelling of the war between the states, as I learned it was called when I got here, the War of Northern Aggression. I didn't know about that either. But it was about retrieving, that whole movement was about retrieving the sense of value and valor that they thought had been lost. And so the perspective was, there were really good things that were lost, and there was a kind of benevolence that wasn't talked about. This got categorized in, pardon the pun, black and white terms. Of course, you've got the horrific features of human enslavement. Of course. Of course, that has to be opposed. There also has to be a tension, because if we're really going to do this and we're not sitting on top of a horse where we know everything, we have to say, I hear in them a sense of loss for something that they thought was really important. And not all of Southern life was, just a loud tribute to the virtues of slavery. That's just not true. I'm a historian, I've dug through. It's very, very complicated. I think the call to being Christian is to step into the complication. It's messy. And to say, those things need to be opposed, but they need to be opposed at the same time that we understand that there's a lot going on there that doesn't fit into nice, neat categories. So I will oppose it with you, stand right next to you, but I'll also say there are things we need to know, which are also true of ourselves, by the way, about the complications of how we deal with our own history and the stories that we tell. As a historian, I know that every account always reflects the historian's ability to arrange facts, which doesn't mean change them, but as a historian, I became really clear. In what order do I put them? What significance do I attach to them? I think the complexity of these questions that you're posing invites us to ask deeply what the more complex issues are so that we can have conversation. It's not going to work if we have, one side versus the other side. This has to move to a point where we can learn to talk to one another. It's like a family spat. We don't necessarily like, sometimes, I've got a brother that I don't get along well with at all, But we've spread that out over decades. And recently I said, I'm not sure we need to keep doing that. And I'm saying about this, some of the people who contributed to the formation of Christian nationalism are not the same people that are identified with Project 2025. It's an error, and I tried very gently to be firm and say this has many, many voices, some of which are very thoughtful, careful, theological thinkers with whom I disagree, but they weren't out trying to subjugate people early on. Van Til was a Reformed theologian who thought that we had misunderstood the implications of Chalcedon, for example. That's a very interesting point if you're a theologian. But that's to say, all of those voices are not reducible to the tyranny, and I agree that it's tyranny, of Project 2025. And I've tried to make the case that that's but one voice, and I didn't really spend a lot of time other than saying, here are people who were affected, here are people who participated in the forming of that, but it's not that alone. There's the whole Catholic movement, independent of that, of traditionalism, of the integralists, independent of that. So then the question becomes, well, what's at stake? And part of it, what's at stake, is dealing with loss. I agree with you that 2025 is not the way I would ever recommend for dealing with loss, and I would oppose it. So I'm not trying to wash it, away or sweep it under the carpet. I'm trying to say it would behoove us to stand more deeply into the question's complexities and engage those complexities.
We have two more questions.
Okay.
And they're going to be brief.
Oh, good.
They will be.
So I promise my answer will be brief. Thank you for the question, by the way.
I loved what you were talking about around COVID and it disrupting the routines that then cause loss because you realize that your routines were too much of a foundation of defining who you were. I was thinking about that in the case of adults where we've had so many people who have lost their jobs as technology has evolved and productivity continues to happen. What can we as members of the church help those people who are going through that transition in a way that doesn't put another false set of routines in order to their lives?
Being present, I think this is very simply, I don't think there are answers to these questions that exceed the value of a willingness of a person to be present. So when somebody's facing a very difficult thing, it's far more important, from my point of view, just to sit with them and to listen and to walk with them than it is to offer, I don't want to be one of Job's friends. A lot of great suggestions, but they don't count, you know? There was one other question.
I think I'm over here.
Okay.
I'll be brief. To start, I was born and raised in the Episcopal Church, so I don't know anything much about Methodism or Presbyterianism or all these other things. But I know that my life has been a spiritual journey, and I'm still journeying. But one thing that I have found is that looking back, when I have seen the deliveries by the Billy Grahams of the world and the Charlie Kirks of the world, and what it has done is bring people to Christ. And I'll say that it has, for me, as growing up, to hear Billy Graham, I think, wow, and look at the masses, and the same thing with Charlie Kirk. I agree there's a lot of things that I don't agree with where he took some things, but to see these young folks all of a sudden finding Jesus Christ, and it just does my heart good, and helping that this will do something for Gen Z as they go forward, because there were a lot of things lost, and I agree with that. COVID thing was just horrible.
I think that's an extraordinarily perceptive sentiment. I will add to it. I'm never sure, as a theologian and as a person, that I know fully what it means to say that a person has been brought to Christ. Sometimes I think that means that I feel relieved that I got another team member. But other times I think it's a way of saying, well, the problem's gonna be less. And I don't know enough about what's going on in the hearts. What I do know is that a number of that generation are tied into transactionalism, and that is not what Jesus taught at all. So I try to avoid labels because categorization takes the ambiguity and the ambivalencies out of life. And I was making the case that what this reminds us of is the grace that occurs in ambivalence rather than clear cut. I hope that lots of young people find their way back from the transactionalism and the sort of addiction to their phones and to a form of communication that I find deeply troubling. As a teacher, it drove me crazy because they couldn't write a sentence, you know. A paragraph was beyond, you know, comprehension, and a term paper, forget it.
Love you too, David. Thank you very much. I do want to say before you applaud how much I'm walking away with the image of marked as Christ owned forever, as
Thank
a
you.
posture, as a faithfulness to a path that takes us to an uncertain future. And for that, I thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.